Welcome to this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Aimie. I have faced a lot of grief in my life, and it's what took me down. It was the final straw that made my body break down into chronic disease. And so in this episode, I wanted to share with you the neurobiology of grief and help explain why grief is so hard for us, why we experience yearning, why our attachment patterns matter, and how our brain is actually designed to help us adapt to loss. The science reveals that what has felt unbearable is actually our brain trying to work as it should, learning to navigate a world that has fundamentally changed when we experience a loss. Joining me is neuroscientist Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. Her groundbreaking research explores how the brain processes grief and how our brain chemistry drives our experience of loss. You are going to learn how grief differs from depression, why yearning activates certain chemical pathways in the brain, and the difference between grief and grieving. You will learn about the role of rumination and avoidance in complicated grief, and how our attachment patterns do influence our experience. If you have not been touched by grief, this will be a good episode for when you will be. If you've already been touched by grief, either your own life experiences or in those around you and the ones that you help, this conversation will change your perspective on the brain's remarkable capacity to help us adapt to loss. Let's get started. So in your studies and your work, what have you found is important about our previous attachment and our attachment relationships for a new loss or grief that we experience in our life? What influence and effect will that have?
I think whenever we think about grief over the death of a loved one, in order to think about grief, first you have to think about love and bonding, right? Because that's what gets lost. That's what gets broken. And so it turns out that we actually know a fair amount about how the brain encodes that bond we have with, that our one and only, right? And it turns out there are really specific parts of the brain that are involved in encoding. This is my special one, right? This is the one that smells like this and sounds like this and looks like this. This is the one you should come back to over and over and over. And if they're missing, you should go look for them or make a big fuss and they will come look for you, right? And so what's so important about the fact that that's captured physiologically in your brain is that your brain then also uses all these powerful neurochemicals to motivate you to seek them out. So dopamine and opioids, oxytocin, and all these strong chemicals that really hold that bond together. Here in the desert Southwest, we think of quail. You see the mama quail and then all the little baby quails sort of following along, right? That invisible tether, that's attachment. But it's invisible, but it's actually in the brains of the animals, right? It's in our brain motivating us to seek them out. And the reason it does that is our loved ones are as important as food and water. We cannot survive, we cannot thrive without having a close loved one in our life. And so I think the way that then that has to be updated, if that person isn't lost, right? If we're not just separated from them on a trip, then the brain has to figure out, wait. This was a forever deal, right? This was an everlasting relationship. That's how I understand what's happening here. And it takes a long time for the brain to be able to predict anything else, right?
As you're talking, I'm reminded that, that dopamine really is the neurotransmitter for craving as well. And in all of my years of addiction medicine, that was the one that was highlighted the most. And yet that's a very natural, healthy neurotransmitter to attach a baby with their primary caregiver. And so when that attachment is not strong or is unstable, is insecure, the changes in dopamine, I would imagine, are definitely going to influence then the dopamine activity with an attachment loss.
Yeah. And I think what's sort of helpful maybe to separate out is we all have attachment neurobiology, right? Like that's just how social mammals work. We attach to someone because we need them in order to survive. And then we attach to the person we fall in love with, right? Because we need them to thrive in the world, regardless. On the other hand, we also know that there are attachment styles. So although we all have attachment, there are some variations, of course, in our history of those attachment relationships. And I think that may be partly what you're thinking about here. One of my earliest neuroimaging studies showed that this part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is not interesting for anyone unless you're sort of a brain geek, but this part of the brain. So to back up, we did a neuroimaging study. We asked people who were bereaved to bring us a photograph of the person who had died. And we did that so that we could get to, see sort of what their reaction, what they were feeling. And we scanned it into the computer. And then while they're laying in a neuroimaging scanner, just like if you get an MRI on your knee or whatever, but this is of your brain, we showed them that photograph on goggles. So they're in the scanner. We're able to look at the blood flow in their brain that tells us what parts of the brain are active. We had also asked them how much they were yearning for that person who had died. And what we found was the more they told us they were yearning, the more activation we saw in this part of the brain, that they were correlated, right? And what's fascinating about that is it is an area rich in dopamine and oxytocin. And since then, a lot of people have made this sort of connection between yearning and craving. But I think it's really important to also make a distinction because, I think the idea that we're addicted to our loved ones, it just doesn't sit right, But this is how I've come to think about it. Because our loved ones are so important, or as important as food and water, our brain has lots of systems to motivate us to go out and seek the things that we need, right? So again, here in the desert Southwest, if you haven't had water for a while and you're out hiking, you can't think about anything else. You're totally focused on the water. Keep thinking about the water, what the water will taste like, right? But we would never say you were addicted to water, right? You just need water. And so I think of it in a similar way. I think of yearning as more like thirst or hunger, right? More so than craving. Drugs of addiction can take over these same brain mechanisms. But I think when we're talking about grief, I think it's more like thirst or hunger.
If I understand you correctly, it's like we're yearning a specific sensation in our body. And so I kind of liken that to yearning the sensation that someone gives me when I'm with them, whether that's a sensation of I'm okay, all is okay, life is okay. It's that specific sensation that we're yearning that we've associated with that person.
Yes, absolutely. We think of those attachment needs as being a safe haven, right? Something goes wrong. This is the person you call. And you find, for many people, after a loved one has died, you still keep picking up the phone, right? Because that's where your brain is telling you to go when you need a safe haven. But it has another function as well. So attachment also has this function we call a secure base. So what that means is because I have that person in my corner, I can also go off to college or go off to work or go off to school, right? Because I know that they're with me, not physically with me, they're with me. That relationship bond is with me in my head, wherever I am. And that enables me to sort of explore the world. And I think one thing that grieving people talk about a lot is just this feeling of withdrawal, not really wanting to go out into the world. And we think those things might be connected, that when we don't have that secure base, it is harder for us initially to go out and engage in the world.
Almost like we've lost that sense of safety. And so I need to move into self-protection. It's not safe for me to expose myself, to grow, to be visible. It's time to retreat with the loss of that sense of my safe base.
And I think over time we find for the vast majority of us who are actually remarkably resilient. But over time, we come to understand what this relationship has meant to us and the parts of that relationship that we carry with us forever, right? I can still talk to my mother and know what she would tell me in lots of circumstances, right? Or, there are lots of moments where I'll think to myself, I'm doing this in part because I share these values with her. She would really be proud of me for doing this. And I think those are ways that we sort of transform our relationship with that person from something on the outside to something on the inside.
And I'm curious, like with all this work that you've now done for, my goodness, many years, so you have this wealth of knowledge. How has that changed how you navigate a grief or a loss in life?
When you see such a wide range of people who are grieving, you realize that almost everything is normal. So when you're experiencing it as, your first big loss or your second big loss or whatever it is, you think, there's no way this is normal, right? There's no way that it should be this painful or that I should do these weird things or that I'm not feeling better yet. All those things that we tell ourselves, it turns out it's pretty normal. And so I think the most maybe dramatic thing I've learned is that we're pretty normal.
I mean, in a sense, it must be wonderful to have that opportunity to normalize it.
I think of grieving as a form of learning. And, I think that there's lots of different things we're learning, right? At some level, we just even have to learn new habits, right? Like somebody has to water the plants, right? In the house. Eventually you learn not to pick up your phone, right? To call them. So there's that kind of learning. And then there's learning like, oh, I am now a person who has grief. What does it mean to have waves of grief? How do I manage that in all sorts of different situations? How do I learn to find comfort in a wave of grief in a way that feels supportive to me? Maybe that's going for a walk. Maybe that's reaching out to someone. Maybe that is, doing meditation or the hundreds of thousands of things we might do to cope. Or even maybe it is ignoring it right now. Now, if that's your only coping strategy, you got to have a whole toolkit. But I think people sometimes feel badly if they do that. And I think that's one of the normal ways to respond.
So what would you tell someone who's in the middle of an acute grief? What message, skills, tools, tips would you have for someone who is immediately in an acute grief from a loss?
I think that for the most part, it is okay to have such a wide range of emotions. Sometimes I feel like just the emotion volume dial got turned up on everything or turned way down on everything. That's also a possibility. But, if you find you're really irritated with people who are trying to be nice to you, or you're really irritated with them, that's just kind of part of it, right? Like everything feels different now. So I think on the one hand, I would say your wide range of feelings is normal. I think the other thing I would say is it's not going to feel like this forever. And this is where I think it can be helpful to think about the difference between grief and grieving. So grief is just that natural response we have whenever we're aware that someone so precious to us has died, right? In the moment, you sort of get bowled over by that grief bomb or grief wave, right? Grieving, on the other hand, is the way that grief changes over time, right? So how it feels today to have a wave of grief is probably different than how it felt to have a wave of grief in that first week. Even if it feels just as bad, it is probably the case that it's somewhat less often. Maybe it's somewhat less intense. But maybe most importantly, it's more familiar, right? So part of that learning curve is just like, the first 100 times you think, this is unbearable. I can't do this. And the 101st time, you may hate it just as much, but you may also think, okay, I hate this, but it is familiar. It doesn't shock me now. And I have some tools in my toolkit of what to do with this feeling. So grieving means over time that the grief changes, even though it goes sort of up and down, right? It's like the stock market. It may always be getting better, but there's a lot of hills and valleys, right, on the way. That's sort of the grieving part. But it also means that we don't have to kid ourselves. We are going to feel grief years later, right? If I walk into a store at Christmas, into the grocery store, and I see those Christmas cookies that my dad and I used to eat a ton of, in that moment, 8 years later, I still have a wave of grief. I get all welled up, and that's always going to happen. That's okay. That's just a natural reaction. It doesn't mean there was anything wrong with my grieving just because I have a wave of grief later. And now, instead of just being totally taken off guard by that, I'll text my sister or I'll buy a box of the cookies and think, this one's for you, Dad, So I think our capacity to navigate grief is what grieving is, not that it goes away per se.
As you have learned about the brain and grief, is there any truth to this concept of layers of grief in the brain and over time?
So although I wouldn't have called them layers, I understand what you're saying. So it turns out once you have this momentous change in your life, you are always going to experience the world as a person who has had that, right? And so what I mean by that is all events in the future are going to be somewhat different because you have this experience now, right? And so what it means is that under different circumstances, that awareness comes with you. And so you might be able to, or you might experience grief in places you wouldn't have before. And I think in that way, the learning never ends. And so we are, sort of aware of new things that we just couldn't have been aware of before.
And it almost seems like it can bring an awareness of those things that are really important to us or that were important to us. And we just didn't realize it because they were just part of our life. And it's not until it's taken away that we realize, oh, that was really important to me. The family get-togethers were really important to me. Mom always being in the kitchen, baking, that felt safe. That was a safe bake. I never knew that. So these new insights that can continue to develop over time that help us understand actually what is important to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's one other way that I sometimes put this that I think can sometimes help people. I like to say to people, when did you get over your wedding day? Right? It's like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Well, having a loss is like that too. There's no getting over it. You now have had a completely changed experience, and that is going to inform everything about how you go forward. That isn't all bad. It just means that you have learned something that you can't unlearn, and you will experience every situation a little bit differently now.
So what about for those people who feel that they've only learned anger from a grief experience? They don't feel like they've gotten any positive lessons or experience out of it. It's put them into a place of anger and they're still stuck there. They don't seem to be grieving. They seem to be stuck in this place, and the loss may have happened decades ago and they still feel like they are stuck. I mean, what do we know about the brain that might help them?
So one of the things that we know is that the vast majority of us are resilient. The vast majority of us over enough months do have a reduction in the intensity and the sort of centralness of the grief in our life. But there are a group of people for whom that is not true. And when we think of that group of people, one of the most important things is that there is good targeted psychotherapy. So not just any psychotherapy, but targeted psychotherapy for prolonged grief that actually empirically shows really good outcomes. People who, as you say, it's been a decade, they go through a good psychotherapy that's focused for grief, and they end up feeling different than they have in years, right? So what we find is that if healing is sort of the natural trajectory, just like if you break a bone, right? Like you're actually doing something to knit the bone back together, right? It's not like consciously undoing anything. You support the leg, right? So you might wear a cast, you might use crutches, right, to help in its natural healing process. But it's something the body does. And I think for many people, grieving is the same way. But sometimes things get in the way of healing that broken bone. So, for example, if you get a second break or you get an infection, right? And then it can be really important to have a professional go in and look at it and sort things out and remove sort of the barriers that have emerged in that trajectory. Well, in some ways, I think of there are barriers that can get in the way as we're grieving as well. And some of those we can identify. So the two that I think about most are avoidance, and the other one is what we call rumination. So I'll talk about that in a sec. But avoidance is, you know how I was saying you often feel the desire to withdraw when you're grieving? Some people have a very difficult time overcoming that again. And so because grief is so painful, it becomes something they're trying to avoid, right? They don't want to drive by the hospital, so they drive out of the way. Or they don't want to go to dinner with their couple friends because they know they're going to be thinking about their loved one, right? All of those times where we're avoiding that feeling, it prevents our brain from having a chance to learn what life is like now, right? So, the first time you go out to dinner with your couple friends, it is going to be a lot of grief. It just is. There's no two ways around it. And hopefully you can have some sort of conversation with them around what would feel supportive, right? Maybe you go for lunch and not dinner or, whatever. But the key is you go back again, right? And the second time you may also feel grief, but you may also get into a conversation about a book you hadn't heard about and then think, oh, I should get that. Seems interesting, right? So there's this very slow sort of upward spiral where you have the good things and you have the bad things. The good feelings and the bad feelings usually come together. If we've been shutting off the bad feelings, human beings don't get to pick, right? You either shut it off or you don't. And so when you shut it off, you don't get any of those positive feelings either, right? And so I think avoidance is something that gets in the way of our learning. The other thing that we do that gets in the way, and this is totally normal in acute grief. This is completely how we just respond, which is rumination, right? You have the thoughts that just go round and round and round. And you're not intending to think about it. You're stopped at the stop sign, right? And suddenly you're thinking about it. That's very normal. And we think that the brain is, again, trying to understand what has happened and sort it out. But for some people, they stay stuck in those round and round and round thoughts. And one flavor of them that's really common in grief is what we call the would've, could've, should've, right? So this is, if only I could have gotten them to the hospital sooner, the doctor should have known to run another test. That one often comes with a lot of anger, right? If only they would have known not to have that last drink, that can come with a lot of anger too. And what we find is that if you think about it, each one of those stories that we make up in our head, and we can make up an infinite number of them. There's an infinite number of ways it could have gone. But each of those stories ends in, and then my loved one would have lived. But the important thing is your loved one didn't live. And there is no answer to those questions. There is no way through the questions. It's not whether the question is something that's true. It's whether the question is something that's helpful to you now. And so the idea is that when we get stuck in those, usually very verbal sort of place in our head, ruminating, it actually detaches us from what's actually happening in the world, right? So if I'm standing in line to get coffee and I'm going round and round and round in my head, it means I haven't even noticed the really sweet smile, of the person next to me, or the hilarious dog that's doing weird things, When we're stuck in our head, we're not in the present. And the present, it does have some painful things, but it has some really wonderful, life affirming things too. And so learning how to manage those thoughts, recognizing, I'm doing it. I'm doing that thing. I'm doing the would have, could have, should have thing. And then finding some alternative ways. And it's interesting what I heard before. One of the ways we sometimes get out of that thoughts is to get into our body. What is my body feeling right now? And by doing that, we can often sort of be like, okay, those are not helpful for me right now. Let's connect with the real world.
And in that sense, it seems that the support, you were talking about creating a cast or supporting a break that would allow the body to heal itself. Seems that the little joys of life, the little positive emotions and moments of connection with other people or just with the present moment would be that support for the body being able to do so much of the healing process itself. And just like you're saying, if we are in our heads, we're going to miss out on all of that support that we could be leveraging for our body and what it needs. And I'm wondering if we have any research on even just the moments that a person can create for themselves versus the need or the additional benefit of being in a community. Like if I go to a park and I'm able to buy a cup of coffee and I'm watching the ducks and I'm smelling my coffee and I'm in my body intentionally to get out of my head, how might that be different than, no, I still really need to connect with a human being, even though may not be able to give me exactly what I want from them. It's a different, and it's also an important part of the connection and support that my body needs.
Yeah. I think, again, this is sort of the big toolkit, right? Like, I think both can be helpful in the right moment, depending on what you need. One way I think about this is when we lose someone, we often feel so alone and so isolated. And the irony of that is exactly a universal human experience to feel really alone. And so in this weird sort of like slant look, you can see because I'm having this experience, I am actually connected to the people around me. It may not always be possible to bridge the words of how to get to that connection, but even just knowing that, even if they haven't had grief yet, even knowing that they will experience this someday can sometimes remind a different kind of connectedness. And I find that feeling of sort of transcending your one moment can happen in nature as well, right? So this feeling of like, I'm part of something timeless. I mean, look at the ocean or look at the mountain, right? It's been here forever. There are moments where that sense of sort of awe can really give you that feeling of safety and security in a different way than people can, but in a way that can fulfill that need that we have.
Almost like it can be an anchor into a sense of safety or safe enough while I feel lost. You mentioned this idea of not having a grief yet and even still being able to get that sense of this is a common human experience. What could people do in order to set up their life, their brain, their body, so that when a grief comes, they're better equipped to move through it?
I mean, I think there are a few things to think about that. One is that we always want to predict what will happen. And how we will feel. And right, like this is the normal thing. This is what your brain does. It tries to predict what's going to happen so it can help you cope with it. I think for the vast majority of people, grief feels different than they expect it to. When we have anticipatory grief, there is grief around whatever is happening at the time, the caregiving or the transition or whatever it is. That grief is very real. And that grief is also about imagining the future. But my experience, at least, is that the grief that we feel when loss has happened often is very different. So, for example, like you said, feeling a lot of anger, that's not really something people anticipate. Or feeling completely numb, right? Who could have guessed that would be the reaction? Having, a pounding heart. Who told you that was going to be, on the deck? And so I think it is actually pretty hard to anticipate. But I will say that the things that we know that are good for mental health are good to have as a basis, right? So having people that you can have meaningful conversations with, creating those relationships in our life means that those people are often there or know us when these things happen, right? So when my dad died, my sister and my best friend from childhood, I knew I could call on them at 4 a.m., right? We have put years into maintaining those close bonds. So they know what's going on with me. I know what's going on with them. And so if I would say something, it was on the backdrop of them understanding who I am, And it's hard. It's hard when you're all busy, right? It's hard to have the hour-long phone call or remember to write a letter or whatever it is, remember their birthday, whatever it is that works for you. But that matters. That's like preventative healthcare,
Can we know that this is something that is preventive? This is going to be something that we need. This is something that we need. And I am really, really hearing from you just how much grief is like navigating change.
Yes.
And change can be stressful.
Yes. Another analogy that I really like, and this one is actually brain-based. So our attachment neurobiology, it turns out, is actually pretty flexible, right? Like the tethers, between the baby bird and the mama bird, they are there for a reason, and they are very strong. But of course, eventually that baby bird does leave the nest and finds their one and only, other bird. And this is one example, one demonstration that our attachment neurobiology is flexible. We can be incredibly close to someone. We can have disruption in that relationship, and we can also become close to someone else. And one of the ways I like to think about this is think about when you moved out of your parents' house, right? How long it took before you felt like you were really an adult, like you really knew what you were doing. It takes forever, right? And then you discover taxes, and then you discover, And I think with loss, that learning curve in some ways is similar. There's no end point. There's a reduction in the grief we feel, but the learning continues on. This is what it means to be in this relationship now that I've had loss, or this is what it means to connect with other people who've lost the same person, but feel differently about it than I do, right? All of those things that we're learning, our brain is set up to help us do that. And it will happen. It is a natural process, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take experience even more than time.
From my experience working with people is that those people who traditionally in their life have not learned how to navigate grief or change well. And even just for change, they tend to be ones who avoid it. And even making rash decisions just because they hate the prospect of sitting in that uncertainty and having to decide something. And so just to do something, just get through it faster, they make a jump. And sounds like those people may be the ones who then go into the rumination or the avoidance more than others when a grief comes, simply because their brain has not been habituated and even trained in how to navigate change without it becoming overwhelming and something that they want to avoid or not feel and stay out of their body.
I think that's a really interesting idea. I've never heard it put quite exactly that way. Partly, I think, because we think of the change around relationships might be very specific in the brain, even. I think you're not wrong, right? Like being able to tolerate uncertainty is a great thing for mental health in every way. So, for example, people who had early childhood loss do often find that they have more difficulty with loss in adulthood. And presumably part of that is having had to try and navigate that when developmentally they didn't have as many options, right? Or if they were in an environment that was not supportive of them having a grieving learning process. So my dad, when my mom died, one of the things that we talk about as being important is trying to come to understand who you are now, not as a part of the we, but what part is you, right? And that, they'd been married for decades, right? And I remember he came to visit me, and he's from a rural area. So we would often go shopping. And I said to him, "Hey, you're here. What should we go shopping for?" He said, "I need new towels." So I said, "Great, let's go." We went to some department store and I picked out some yellow towels and show him. And he was like, "No, I want purple towels." I was like, "I don't like purple towels. What are you talking about?" He was like, "No, I want purple towels." And I realized in that moment, like he was trying to tell me, I'm different now, right? Like this is what I want. He ended up painting the bathroom, right? This is who I am now. And that's sort of clarifying who you are. He didn't like yellow, but when my mom was alive, he was like, whatever, I don't care. But now it became important, right? So even at his age, he was able to sort of find that newness, right? And I think that is an important part of the process.
I love that. Discovering who we are now and letting that be an evolving process. What have I not asked you that I should ask you?
I think the only other thing that often comes up is sort of about the difference between depression and grief. I think some people have an intuitive sense of this, but others may not. And what we know now is that depression is different from grief, even from prolonged grief, but you can get depressed after you lose a loved one, right? So you can get depressed, you can have prolonged grief, you can have both, right? It's like depression and anxiety. You can get both, of them. What's important about that, I think, is that the grief is very much about yearning, right? Wanting this loved one back, or wanting things to be the way they were, or is about the person. And usually grief comes in waves. That is just its natural state. Depression, on the other hand, is usually always present, right? Like even if it's on the back burner, but it's always there. And it has this way of sort of metastasizing to everything. So it's not just that you feel sad about your loved one dying, but you also feel guilty about climate change, and you feel like you were a terrible mother, and right? Like everything goes into the depression mood. And so I make that distinction because what we know is that interventions for depression can be very, very useful and helpful, including antidepressants, if you have depression. But if what you are dealing with is grief, antidepressants, it turns out, aren't necessarily helpful for that yearning. And so I just sort of like to make the distinction because I think even when people are seeking out treatment, it can be helpful to know that there's a difference.
Absolutely.
Or you can have both.
Or you can have both, right? And imagine that would be a little more challenging to help a brain that's been in depression go through that grieving change and learning lessons. And thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for tuning into this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. As we've learned, grief is not something that we simply get over. It's a process of learning a different way of living our life. And if you would like to learn more about grief and its connection with overwhelm, caregiving, and our physical health, I have resources for you in the show notes. You will find links to the Essential Sequence Guide so that we know that we don't just start anywhere when we are working through grief. Whether you are a self-help individual, a parent, or practitioner helping others, there is a sequence to safely opening up grief, especially once we or someone else has a chronic health symptom. This is a short guide to that essential sequence, and I will have that in the show notes. There is the foundational journey. If you are ready to join me for a safely guided 6-week journey into the nervous system to safely open up stored grief, then this is where you can start with me. In the first 21 days, individuals experience 15% more joy, 28% more energy, and 28% less depression. If you would like some other podcast episodes related to this topic, episode 42 is one you will want to look at. Unlocking the role of disguised grief in health. Episode 76 was on navigating the grief journey, the polyvagal way to become an active operator of your nervous system with Deb Dana. And with that, I am here to save you time and money by bringing you practical information that will help you accelerate the healing journey. So please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review if you have already subscribed. Your reviews and feedback are how I know to improve this podcast, bring you great content, and help others find information that can change their life as well. I'm your host, Dr. Aimie. Until next episode, lots of love.